My name is Beth Fisher Yoshida, and I'm the Program Director of the Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program at Columbia University. And I'm very happy to present the first webinar of 2022, which will be with Dr. Lee Beisel, and he'll be presenting on refugees, migration, and displacement, insights for conflict resolution. And this will be available afterwards as a recording, and it'll be on our website. And then the people who have registered will also receive a link. I'll do a little bit of an introduction here for Lee, and it'll be a very brief introduction, not quite doing justice to who he is. He is the Sinton Visiting Professor in Holocaust, Genocide, and Refugee Studies at the University of San Francisco. He also serves as a lecturer at UC Berkeley in Leadership and Communications, and since the mid-1990s, he's been a senior moderator of leadership seminars at the Aspen Institute. And his book, Refugees in America, Stories of Courage, Resilience, and Hope, was published in September 2019 by Rutgers University Press, and prior to the COVID outbreak. He was on an extensive speaking tour. Throughout his career, many of the programs he has developed have focused on leadership and civic discourse. And Lee is deeply committed to reclaiming in today's society the art of conversation, respectful civil discourse, and the ability to listen and respect people who hold different views. And boy, do we need that. Born in Los Angeles, he graduated from the University of California, Berkeley with a BA in philosophy and his doctorate from the Claremont School of Theology. And in June of 2019, Governor Newsom of California appointed him to the State Council on Developmental Disabilities, where he now serves as the vice chair. And of course, his CV goes on, and he's had quite a few publications and so on. But without further ado, I just want to bring Lee on. And he will present for about 20-30 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for Q&A. So please send in comments and questions to the Q&A box that I will be able to access afterwards. So take it away, Lee.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm honored to be part of this. Good afternoon, everybody. If you're on the East Coast, I'm out here on the West Coast in Northern California, so it's morning for me. And I know some of you may be around the world. I'm delighted you're here. I look forward to making the best use of our time together. First thing I'm going to do is to share my screen and put this up. So friends, let me just put it on full screen so we have it. There we go. This morning, we gather this afternoon, wherever you are, in what you all know, but I always want to acknowledge it, are extremely turbulent times of confusion, uncertainty. Who am I? How do I make sense of this world? And I'm sure, like me, all of you are more and more confused, even as we enter into 2022 with the Omicron variant and everything that's going on. Second thing is, there's more people on the move on this planet than there have ever been before. Refugees, migrants, people who are internally displaced. For all kinds of reasons, we're going to look at some of that, but it is a growing phenomena, not a decreasing one that one has to take serious note of. And number three is my work, and Beth, thank you again for the introduction, and my book is, I believe when we talk about these issues of global migration, we often politicize it. My work is to go beyond the politics of these situations, to look at the human values of it, to look at the ethics, to look at how do we, especially all of us who live in this world of conflict resolution, of negotiation, of peace building, how do we go beyond these, what the politics do to it, to look at the real values involved. So today I'll be presenting for a while, then we'll have questions. I have two assignments for you. The first, I'd love you to keep a note of what insights you think you have as we enter this world of the refugee and migration today. What insights do you have about your work, about what you're doing in this space of conflict resolution? And number two is, how are we all refugees? How, when we look at the qualities that we're going to go through and the characteristics, how in some ways are we all deeply connected to the refugee experience? And I'm also mindful, everyone on this webinar today, you have your own stories, you have your own experiences. I would imagine there are probably people on this call today who have been forcibly displaced or refugees. But with that, I invite you into this world that I've known for many, many years. 2004, I made my first trip to Eastern Chad. This was the beginning of the conflict in Darfur, and I wanted to go to bear witness, to be present where there was human trauma, human suffering, and to see it and hear it personally, and then to make a commitment to do whatever I could to help out. That's another story for another time. I start with this photo. This is a refugee camp by the name of Kunungo in Eastern Chad. And here, this is a typical sub-Saharan refugee camp. These tents are people's homes. This is where they live. This is where they've made the long trek from Darfur over to Eastern Chad, and they're living in these tents. And you notice, by the way, the little walls that people have made in front of their tents, which protects one from nothing, but the need for all people, especially all of us who've gone through trauma, to try to have some protection. These three beautiful children. They've worn clothes they've probably been wearing for months and months and months. When I look at them, I see human potential. I also see human trauma and what people have gone through. And I jumped past that first slide where Ishmael Bea, who wrote the book, A Long Walk Home, he was a child soldier in Sierra Leone. And he posits the question is, when will all this be over? I don't know when it ends for victims of trauma, how we go ahead. The second shot is a close-up of three kids that I played a lot with. When I did these visits I made, and this was the first of what ended up being about 6, 7 visits to that region, I would sit out in the sand with these young kids and I would play the game of hiding a rock in one hand and saying, can you find it? The girl on your right, my left, in the kind of red dress, she identified where the little pebble was every time in my hands. Finally, I said enough. I put it behind me so no one could possibly see it. She got it right every time. For me, it entered a world of, here was a young woman who fate had dealt a terrible blow, like so many people, the hundreds of millions of people on the move today in the world. But she has the potential of being a great doctor. She has the potential of being anything she wishes to. Maybe she's the woman that will find the cure for cancer. It brought me into a world that prior to my trip to Chad, of the truly dispossessed, the truly vulnerable. And I keep learning so much from these wonderful people I've met about life, about how we deal with trauma, and about how we go on. This is just the inside of a tent. And I show this to you because just imagine leaving everything behind, carrying a few blankets, carrying a few jackets, a few things, and living in a tent like this of how do you go on? How do we as people who deal, whether it's at an individual level of peace building, a global level, between countries, warring parties, how do we take this truth and hold it in one of ours in our work? So I just wanted to give you a quick definition of a refugee. This is from the 1951 UN Refugee Convention. These are people, refugees are people who have been persecuted or have a legitimate fear because of race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a social group. That's not an exhaustive definition. It's being pushed in a lot of ways in the past decade of gender identity. Many, many things going on here that are not included. And what we're also seeing are people fleeing their homes because of climate. And we've seen that in the United States. We're seeing it globally of what's going on, of more and more people on the move. A person who deals with this beautifully is the Chinese dissident Ai Weiwei. This is a 2017 film he made. I'm just going to show you the professional trailer of it. It's a long, long movie. And what I love about Ai Weiwei's work, he shows the scale of people on the move and the trauma that goes on for all these people. And he shows the human story. So walk with me for a minute into the world that Ai Weiwei shares with us.
Being a refugee is much more than a political status. It is the most pervasive kind of cruelty that can be exercised against a human being. You are forcibly robbing this human being of all aspects that would make human life not just tolerable, but meaningful in many ways.
The more immune you are to people's suffering, that's very, very dangerous. It's critical for us to maintain this humanity.
الان 60 روزه با پسرم همینطوری داریم میچرخیم، ولی هیچ کس نیستش که بگه یه راهی رو بخواد به ما نشون بده. کجا برم زندگیمو شروع کنم؟
If children grow up without any hope, without any prospects for the future, without any sense of them being able to make something out of their lives, then they will become very vulnerable to all sorts of exploitation, including radicalization.
ليش انتوا هنا اليوم؟
طشة آخر الفصل. المنفذ الوحيد في غزة، في السجن الكبير غزة، مش في غزة، السجن كبير يعني.
The officials came here and told them, look, there's no way you're going to get papers to continue. Either you go voluntarily or we arrest you.
I respect you. I respect the passport and I respect you.
It's going to be a big challenge to recognize that the world is shrinking and people from different religions, different cultures are going to have to learn to live with each other.
What makes human life tolerable? How do we maintain our humanity in the midst of a world that is so chaotic? And again, what Ai Weiwei does so brilliantly, you could see the scale and you could see the individual. In thinking about this, because I think it's deeply connected to who we are and what are our roles. How does one go beyond the noise of the world? I'm not going to describe all that noise. You live in it as much as I do, with technology and TV and the bombardment of our iPhones and being on call. How does one see beyond the noise? I came across this wonderful concept, some of you may know, called Sonder. There's a writer by John Koenig called The Dictionary of Obscure Sorrows. His argument is that in English, our words often don't have the depth of words in other languages, and he's taken it upon himself to come up with words that capture more complex emotions. To Sonder means the following: you and me, every one of 7.5 billion human beings on this planet, we're the central people, we're the central part in our own stories. When we go out in the world, there's lots of extras. When I go down for the morning coffee at the coffee shop, there's the people in Starbucks or wherever I go. There's all the people in the subway or wherever. And often we don't take in that they're the central actors in their stories. And what he's getting at with this concept of to Sonder is a realization of the potential of each life beyond ourselves. It's a fascinating concept. And then we all know the role of empathy. How do we cultivate our heart and our spirit? We know how to cultivate our intellect. We know how to cultivate the gifts of the mind, but as peace builders, as negotiators, as people who seek to take people who suffered trauma, how do we cultivate our own gifts? How do we go beyond ourselves? When I sat in these refugee camps on all of my trips and I listened to some of the most horrific stories I've ever heard shared by a human being, I realized that it was not just taking in the words, it's taking in the whole experience. It's taking in the magnitude of trauma, not letting it traumatize me, but trying to connect to it at a deeply human level to be able to go on. As you all know, our work has to start with a self-awareness. What are my traumas? What's been there for me? And I believe when we look at these stories of refugees and we look at what's going on with them, I believe it helps us to connect at a deeper level and become more self-aware. And finally, many of you know the concept of Ubuntu. And Mandela was a great hero, as all you know, talked about only when we find the humanity in others. Is that not our work? Is that not what it's about? And is that not the many refugees I know who've gone on to live good lives, still filled with trauma here in America? What they're exceptional at is finding humanity in other people. And I learn from that all the time. This picture I came across about 4 or 5 years ago when I was in Amsterdam interviewing Syrian refugees. And it kind of gives it away, it's there, but you can see on the man's coat on the left lapel, a yellow star. So obviously this is a picture drawn during the Holocaust. But what grabs me about this photo and why I show it to you today, we don't know this man's story. What's that behind him? Was that just a place he stopped? Was that his home? Was that his community? What did he leave behind on his journey? And then you see carrying in his right arm a bag, which is called a rucksack, kind of a German word, a rucksack, a bag with him. Where's he going? What did he pack with him? Are we not all people on that journey? And do all the displaced people in the world, do they only push us? And maybe that's why so many people can't deal with the notion of displacement, can't deal with migration in the world, because it scares us at a very deep level, because we're all people like this man on his journey. What do people like that gentleman, what do people like every refugee I've had the privilege of meeting, what do they bring with them? They bring their stories. And I know it's talked about a lot. I love the human story. I love getting into it, understanding it, impacting. What are their stories? Their stories are of a past that they can't go back to. Their stories are of trauma and loss. What a profound human emotion of loss. We all deal with it, don't we, all the time? An incredible desire to find stability, confusion. Who will I ever trust in this world? Understanding, powerlessness, vulnerability. And in the book I did, I took 11 human beings who came to America, the oldest being a woman in her mid-90s, who you'll meet in 1 minute, the youngest being a DACA beneficiary in his mid-20s. And I talked about their journeys and what they brought with them to America. And you look at all these qualities and so many more, but how do we truly listen to different narratives and stories? And refugees and all people on the move, I think they taught me so much about how to understand these key values. A few people I just want to share with you this morning from my book. Walita Sanguma, he's from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and he's a man doing incredible things here in America. He lives down in the San Diego area. Walita was 9 years old on Christmas Day, 1998, when the church he was in, a bomb went off outside. And just briefly, the conflict in DRC has gone on for decades. Over 6 million people have been killed in that conflict. And hundreds of thousands, if not millions, have been displaced all throughout the DRC, other countries in Africa. Welita, after the bombing that day, was out on his own for quite some time before reconnecting and starting a journey with his mom and a few siblings that he managed to connect with that ultimately would bring him to America. About 6 months into COVID, I was in touch with Welita, and I talked to Welita and I said, how are you getting through this? How do you survive in these tough times that is going on in the world after all you've been through? And he shared this with me. It's so interesting. During a time of crisis, we often, and again, you and I do it, we think of self-preservation. And look what he says, undermining the central fact that we're codependent. And he said it wasn't until years after that Christmas day that I realized an important truth. We need one another. The power of community, the understanding that I'm not alone, continues to drive my conviction to persevere through any challenge. But here I just want to ask, we need each other. Do the perpetrators and the victims need each other? Do the bystanders and the victims need each other? Is it not all human beings? And again, Welita's insight is one I think about every day. Sidonia Lax, survivor of Auschwitz, survivor of so much, and you see the fierceness on her face. The photographer did a phenomenal job in capturing Sidonia's resolve. And this woman went on to do so much in her life. She's now in her mid-90s in LA and is not doing well. Sidonia tells the story that before going to Auschwitz, she was in hiding with her dad. There was no food. One day, her father heard that there were apples in the ghetto. He went out to try and get her one. Self-preservation, right? Protecting your child. He goes to get her one. He never came back. What does Sidonia do? In the decades that she spoke to high school groups and everything she did here in California and back in Poland, she would go to, she always gave out green apples and told her story that even after all that happened to her, she was resolved to go on. But look at that face. She carried that trauma with her until today. Hannah Arendt, a survivor of the Holocaust, puts it so beautifully about loss. And I ask you to consider this in all that we do. We lost our homes, which means the familiarity of daily life. We lost our occupations, which means the confidence. We all want to be of some use. We lost our language, which means the naturalness of reactions, the simplicity of gestures, the unaffected expression of feelings. How do we deal with loss? How many people carry loss with them throughout their whole life? How does that impact the work we do in trying to move forward, in trying to solve issues? And finally, Asinja Bedell, woman, I'd love to tell you about all these people much more. She's a Yazidi from Iraq. This was a meeting I had with her in Houston. All I want to tell you about Asinja for today, she suffered more trauma, more horror than any human being should ever go through on this planet or any planet that I know of. She's now a successful businesswoman down in Houston. We're sitting and behind her is a beautiful view of Houston. But you can see in her eyes the tears. When she sat and took me back to Iraq and her trying to escape Baghdad and that violence-torn city with dead bodies everywhere, she wasn't telling me a story. She brought me back to Iraq with her, but yet somehow she goes on. So finally, I want to share with you in my allotted time and then turn it back over to Beth. These are some things that I consider, that I just throw it out to you this morning, that to me, I asked you to consider two things before, your own insights and how we're connected. I do this work for many reasons, but the reason I share with you today is the following. I think the refugee experience touches all of our experience at a profound level. If you're human, you've suffered loss. If you're human, you're vulnerable. If you're human, You've got your own trauma at some magnitude. To me, I learned from Asinja and Walita and Sidonia and so many others. I've learned more about perspective, about curiosity, about resilience and hope and courage, about empathy being more than just a concept, but being a way of life, about respect and inner strength, about the need to really try and understand and clarify, and the need, I would put it this way, about honoring one's past so that one can move ahead. How do we take pasts that are complicated and turbulent, especially in the work that you all do, whether it's with a family, whether it's with a business, whether it's with corporations, whether it's with countries, whoever it might be with, how do we look at all these things in ourselves and also create and allow a space for other people to stand and flourish in so they can do their work constructively? With that, I'm going to stop share. So thank you all for listening. I look forward to your questions and reactions and thoughts on this little presentation.
Thank you so much, Lee. So I encourage everybody to please write in some questions and comments so that we can gain some of Lee's knowledge on that. So just to start off, so there are so many tragic stories, right? And there are also stories of resilience, which you showed as well. And so really thinking about the population of the majority of people who I think who are attending this webinar who work in the area of conflict resolution, alternative dispute resolution, peace building, what are some things from your experience that you see people with refugee status need that people in our profession can possibly provide? In what ways can we be effective in working with these populations?
Great question. I just want to say one thing that I didn't say during the presentation. Most people on the move in the world, the vast majority, will never be resettled in a comfortable way. Most people will never get refugee status. From my experience, what do people want? They want someone who will hear their past and, how would I put it, not view them as a refugee. They do not want that to be the central definition of their lives. They want to be viewed as a human being, like you and me, who has a lot to give, but they want someone who will honor and appreciate that. If you say, I'm from Sierra Leone, if I'm from the DRC, if I'm from Syria or Afghanistan, to take current issues today, that it will be someone who will care and respect that past, but not reduce them and their whole life to the refugee narrative.
Okay, so you actually made an interesting distinction there, as you said that most people on the move will not be resettled and they will not gain refugee status. So I use the term more loosely than the official terminology of refugee status. So what does it take to become a refugee with having refugee status, and what are the benefits of that status?
So great question. So right now the UN estimates, I think as of today, that there's 85 million people who are refugees and internally displaced in a few other categories. And by the way, there's more people in today's world that are internally displaced. What does that mean? For example, Syria is a great example of internal displacement, or Afghanistan. You've lost your home, you've lost everything Hannah Arendt described, complete loss, but you're somewhere else in the country in hiding and you can't get out. A refugee, and let's take Syria, someone who's managed to get out of Syria, go to a country, many people have gone to Lebanon or end up in Turkey, to another country. You file a claim with the UN. It gets acknowledged that you've been persecuted for one of the reasons listed above. And here, Beth, it's so painful. You have to prove it. It can't just be Lee saying, this happened to me in Damascus. I got to somehow prove it happened to you. And there's got to be enough. So a woman who has, if one were to use a little bit of irony and humor, which I do use because of my work, I need to, my friend Asinja from Iraq, she got refugee status easily. because the world knows about what happened to the Yazidis. Many of you may remember when Mount Sinjar was surrounded, and that's when Obama ordered that we bomb around there so that the Yazidis could escape. So you get automatic status. Short of that, you don't. So just to make it real, Beth, even out here in California, in California, we have many people who are coming from the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and many people coming from Mexico. No one from Mexico, no one, to my knowledge, will ever get refugee status, even if they're fleeing any of the things we saw on the about being persecuted. It takes they won't get it coming from Mexico. From the Northern Triangle, they may, but you have to be able to demonstrate that this act of violence was committed to you, not because it was personal, but because of something else that fits that status. So very, very hard to get. In the United States now, in the past number of years, it's become even harder.
Yeah. So you mentioned internally displaced persons, and I know that I continue to do a lot of work in the country of Colombia. And before Syria, that had the highest number of internally displaced persons in the world. And now Syria has that unfortunate title there. So in working with people who are internally displaced, right? So they flee their home, their roots, wherever their family is from, their tradition, to go to another place inside the same country. And even though they're in the same country, they're still outsiders. They're still not from that place, and they're still unsettled in some way, even if they do try to establish new roots and take on new roles and so on. So from your experience in helping people feel connected, helping people feel a part of a community, helping people build community, whatever terminology we want to use, what are some of the things that you've seen that have been effective in helping people reestablish who they are and their identities in a new geographical location?
Great question. And just as you mentioned Colombia, Colombia continues to be a center of where many refugees from Venezuela are going. And by the way, that number is more and more staggering every day. Last I read, I think it was 7.3 million, not all in Colombia, but Colombia has taken in a tremendous amount of Venezuelan refugees.
I think there are at least 2 million, if not more, that I heard.
Yeah, I think so. That's the latest I saw. I think what people need, and here again, I always connect it back to, I think for any of us in this space, we got to look at what do we need? People need little things, because everything they lost, I often refer to the Hannah Arendt definition. When you've lost everything, your familiarity, everything you knew, one has a deep human need to start feeling comfortable again. So I think about a Sinja in Houston. So I'll take just someone, and we can go to displaced people in a second. All these people are the most grateful, not for the big things that were done for them. They've all told me stories here in America about the person that came and taught them the bus system in the city they live in, helped them, how do you go to the market and buy groceries? And so when you deal with large displaced communities in Lebanon and wherever, how do we allow people and bring them into the simple things that we take for granted? What I find is there's nothing to take for granted in dealing with this population. There's no common assumptions. It's like, I'll give an example to you, Beth, and I don't know if you can relate to this, but I do fairly well with technology, but I'm not great. You ever tried to call one of these companies and have them explain something to you about how to fix something at home? And I often say to the nice person who's trying to explain it that, I'll be honest, I don't understand a word you're saying. I don't speak computer. I bring these people, what the human desire is, how do I get some food? How do I find shelter for tonight? How do I get basic services? And that's the other thing. I've been currently working with some women in Nairobi, and it reminds me every time I do these conversations with these women in Nairobi, there's no social services there. There's nothing of what we have in the United States. Here we have an ability to help people access. But when you're talking about people fleeing into other countries, it's how do we give people dignity, respect that any human being, I think that's maybe the most important thing, is to show respect and give people dignity. So I looked at, I haven't been to Columbia, but when I went to Germany, Germany and Chancellor Merkel will always get to me whatever she deserves, a Nobel Prize. I hope she gets it one day. That she took in 1 million Syrian refugees. Germany can't handle them all. But when I went to see the work they're doing, what certain people are doing, and this is to me bureaucrats who go beyond what's expected of them, besides having people fill out the paperwork, they treated people with kindness, respect, and dignity. So that's a long-winded answer. Go on.
Yeah, it's great. Okay, we do have some other questions here from listeners. So one of them really, the next question really addresses what I think a lot of us are very sensitive to, is how much do you deal with the trauma? So please tell us more about how you strike the balance between honoring someone's trauma, which you've spoken to, while avoiding re-traumatization.
It's a great question. A lot of my questions when I did the whole book tour about my book is people want to really know, how did I listen to people? How do I work with people as a writer, as a storyteller, as all the stuff I do? What I tried to follow is to create rapport and allow a person to feel safe, to make sure a person feels safe. And then when they share the story of trauma, is to acknowledge and affirm it in whatever techniques and skills we all use, to make sure they know that I got it, and allow them to direct where they want to go from there. What I have found is most want to move on from it. Now, I will add to the questionnaire and to you, Beth, the following. In all my work, part of it is much access we have are to, and I'm going to use the larger word, displaced people who have been able to go on with life. People who are really suffering from depression are generally not the people who are seeking out help. So I worked, one woman on my book from Cambodia, lives right over here in Oakland, right near me. She lives with severe trauma. Thank God has good psychiatrists, great medication, good therapists. It's unusual to get to people in that much trauma. But for all of them, it's allowing them to share what they wish to. And I believe that when people share deeply personal things, or, and again, this may sound trite, and forgive me for sounding this way, but like when I would sit in the clinics in Chad, I would be privy to women sharing horrific stories about what happened to their village, what happened to them personally. And I watched the healthcare workers, they didn't really say to the woman, were you raped? They let the story speak for itself. And it was obvious they had been raped, and they didn't have the need to put our narrative and our terms. They took it in whatever terms the person who'd suffered it from. And that's another part of advice I try to give on this, is don't try to reframe it for the person. Let it stick, hold it, and then see if the person can move on from there. And most people that we probably will work with in many communities are with us because they want to move on. Regrettably, very, very hard to get to people who don't want to move on.
Yeah, interesting too. You talk about reframing, because a lot of the work we do in the field is about reframing different kinds of things. You're saying stay true to the wording and so on. So there's another question here. What political strategies do you consider as successful when dealing with a reality like the one Colombia is leading with internally displaced people and Venezuelan refugees? I think they mean living with internally displaced people and Venezuelan refugees. So if you want to go into the political world.
So entering the political world, which I try not to, but it's part of this whole world, I'll say a few things. What's going on in Colombia is not sustainable. I wish it was, but Colombia is a small country. Beth knows much more than I do about Colombia. It's not sustainable. They can't continue, because now we're starting to see a backlash in Colombia from the articles I've been looking at, We see this in Germany, a tremendous backlash. But let me speak to what I know best about. Again, regrettably, I can't see any of you, don't know any of, maybe I know you, maybe I don't. You'll write to me later if I know any of you. Let's look at America. Friends, whatever your political beliefs are, whatever your views, whatever party you belong to or not, that we don't have comprehensive immigration reform in this country is a moral crisis. President Bush wanted it. President Obama wanted it. One time the Democrats blocked it with Bush, and one time the Republicans blocked it. I am an equal opportunity critic of everyone. Can't we figure out a way to start with DACA beneficiaries, with the families of DACA beneficiaries, with people who come here? And I know there's a part of California, the Central Valley, Visalia. I work with a company down there where there's a lot of people who come from Mexico. Can't we find a way for people who are contributing so much to America to become legal? Our inability to do that, this is much more about us. How does the world grapple with this? And I will just say, and again, this would be subject for a long, long discussion, which I'd love to have with any of you that wish to. We're not doing it well. The world is really struggling with it. What does it mean to take in people? Because what are the arguments? We got to take care of our own here in America. We got to take care of our own Colombia. We got to take care of our own in Germany. You get that rhetoric, but then you look at those pictures as sent by Weiwei, or the videos which are real. How do we not find room for others? How do we not find room? Take Afghan refugees in America. How could anyone truly be opposed to resettling Afghan refugees? Well, we're the ones that help make them refugees. So I could go on and on about politics, but what I look at is how does one find fair, comprehensive, reasonable, comprehensive immigration reform? And I just have to add to that, Beth, when my book first came out, an old friend of mine called me up and said, "Oh, Lee, it's great you have a book out." Like many people, he didn't even have the book. He just saw the title, Refugees in America. And he said, "Yeah, great work, Lee, but I got to tell you, I don't agree with you." So I said, "Hey, Dan, what don't you agree with?" He says, "Well, unlike you, I don't want to have open borders." So I said, "Dan, where did I ever say that a country should have open borders? We shouldn't have open borders. No country in the world can do that. But what does it mean to be human and not feel for the people who are going through what they are in Syria or Venezuela? They didn't cause the problem, or Afghanistan. How many people can we take in? What's right? And by the way, in every country around the world, if you look at start with economic contribution of people the countries take in, it's huge. So that's my political rant for a few minutes. Thank you for giving me that to the questionnaire.
Okay. I think that from the work a lot of us do in conflict resolution, I think part of the mindset of scarcity is what happens when people feel threatened. So then you get that rhetoric which says, well, if we give them, then what do we have for us? And so as though it's coming out of somebody's personal pocket or the food is coming off of their actual table and so on. So working with mindsets, if we don't work with the mindset, in that case, to reframe, what does it really mean to give humanitarian support? I think that will always get in the way, because then people get very protective because they're feeling threatened about it and they want to hold on to what they have because there's a belief that they're letting go or giving up or losing something that they have.
So important, and I'd love to reframe the American rhetoric about that, because you're absolutely right. And that, to me, one can't reframe their story, but one can reframe the world and how we approach it and how one moves on. That's where the reframing is needed in conflict resolution. And even if you look at, I was in South Sudan 3 months before it became a country. Look at South Sudan and North Sudan. There are plenty of people, I know many Sudanese refugees who came to this country. There are many people who want to find ways for peace there. And again, Beth, you're so right, because in many of these countries, it goes beyond, it goes to the issues of environment and climate. It goes to the issue of economics. How does one allow the past to have a voice to me, it's always, how do you allow the past to have voice, but not control the present? I have found conflicts that are most resolvable is when you give voice to the past, but it doesn't have the controlling card for the present. That's, to me, the art. One saw that in Rwanda. I had the privilege of going to Rwanda, of the reconciliation work that was done there, where it worked well. In many cases it didn't, but where it worked well was when people could give voice to the horror of the past, but be willing to accept the present. And isn't that what we're dealing with in the world today with everything that's going on in America? How do we honor the past, but live in 2021 and plan for a future?
Yeah, thank you for that. Another question. I was impressed with your human rights perspective on conflict resolution. What do you see as the role of conflict resolution in advancing human rights vis-a-vis the efforts to hold those perceived as the abusers of human rights accountable? So how do we hold the abusers of human rights accountable?
Great question. So if you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the abuses going on in our country, all around the world, I think one has to, even though it's hard, has to make a hierarchy of abuses in a way and identify what human rights being violated really need our attention. Because I often find we're in a world, and again, we all have hurts we carry. I have plenty of hurts we carry. I can tell you a variety of stories. You can all tell me a variety of stories. How do we identify, sorry about this ringing, I don't know how to stop that in the background, human rights? And I believe the whole discipline of conflict resolution, of peace sustaining, of peace nurturing, has an ability to look at human rights violations and say, again, how do we go beyond the trauma of the violation to the acceptance of that there's been violations, but what should be the norm? But here again, and I'm not sure I'm answering the question well, because it's one I want to consider more. And I love questions like that for discussion and that to really reflect on. Take in America, what are basic human rights? Friends, is everyone entitled to health care? Many of you on this webinar and me may say, oh yeah, but we don't live in a country that extends that. I think healthcare is a basic human right. And, you know, I always look, and Beth, I just have to weave in, look at the Declaration of Independence, which I've studied. I love that document. Look what the founding people of our country said. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Does that all sound good, friends? You like that? I'm going to run for Congress saying, I give you life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Well, if I was running for Congress in your area, what would you say? Hey, Lee, what does life mean? Tell us about end-of-life issues, abortion, beginning of life issues, all of that. Liberty, how far does liberty go? What we love liberty in this country. And the pursuit of happiness, what the heck does that mean? So we have a document that framed this country that is really, it's a broad-based concept where the real work to be done on human rights is, well, first of all, I want to ask, and we come to MLK. I have to just say a word, Beth, if you can, because you give me a little bit of format here. I'm against MLK Day. Now, I probably got your attention with that, right? Why am I against it? Because for the most part, it's become another holiday in America. I want to see every school in America read Letter from the Birmingham Jail. What a great way to learn about human rights. How many schools that you know of and I know of are reading that text and getting out in the community and doing acts of justice? So I'm joking. I don't want to see it eliminated, but I want to see it infused with meaning. So I think we who live in this space have a great chance to inform human rights work by our expertise that conflicts can move towards resolution. We can take a few baby steps by advancing human rights. So that's an overall rant about MLK Day, about human rights. And I hope it in some ways starts to address your question. I don't know if it did.
Yeah, I think part of the challenge is that it can be so overwhelming, because when you look at the pictures you showed and you hear the stories and just the sheer number of people who are displaced, then it's overwhelming. It really is overwhelming. And I think sometimes we don't have the capacity to deal with that level of complexity. And so we shut down and try to push it away.
And Beth, that's just to add a comment. It's, to me, the goal in life is, how do I take all this? There's so much in this world. How do I bring it down? What can I do? What can I impact? And an important principle, which I'm sure goes on, you can't talk about all the time. So you read my bio, I'm the vice chair of the State Council on Developmental Disabilities. What's the why? My almost 5-year-old granddaughter has Down syndrome. That's the why. But why would I serve on a state bureaucracy as a volunteer and devote a lot of hours? For the following reason. On the state council appointed by the governor, there's 30 people. 10 of those people have an intellectual or developmental disability. They're at the table shaping policies in the state of California. And I believe that about this space. I will never go to a meeting that looks at reshaping migration policy, looking at refugees and all this, unless there's someone from that community at the table giving their input about the complexity of the situation. And, you know, Beth, I think it was the famous Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes who once said, the goal in life is not simplicity, nor is it to stay in complexity. But I believe he said is, how do you get to simplicity on the other side of complexity? I think that's our work, isn't it? Is how do we start to see these two parties, you want to move on or not? If you want to move on, how are we going to get to some simple principles that both parties, even with their hurts, their different narratives, that we can maybe buy into and walk ahead?
Mm-hmm. So looking for those possibilities, those islands of agreement we talk about. Hey, another question from a listener is, how can we assure the best integration possible for non-accompanied minors? What role can already social integrated refugees have in this process? That's a whole special population of people that we've seen increase over the years.
I think their role is critical. They get it. They know what an unaccompanied minor is gone through or is going through. And, you know, there's regrettably, there's probably other examples. I never saw it say there's only one example. There's an incredible town outside of Atlanta, Georgia. If any of you live down in Atlanta, which I've had the privilege of visiting a number of times, Clarkston, Georgia. This is and there's great films and videos about this. You can YouTube it or whatever. There's more people from refugees from countries around the world living there than anywhere else in America. But there's many great parts of Clarkston, but one of the parts that's often not talked about, these communities often live highly segregated areas. So when I go around there, someone says to me, oh, Lee, that's where people from Burma are living. Oh, Lee, that's where people from Afghanistan are living, or people from Cambodia. Often, people who have gotten in are so focused on what they need to do to survive that they often don't have the room and space to help. In the questionnaire asked about unaccompanied minors, I'd like to find more room and more ways of connecting these communities of people who have been here. So like out in California, a community that we know well in Southern California, we resettled here after Cambodia and Vietnam, the genocide in Cambodia and the war in Vietnam. We resettled a tremendous amount of Cambodian and Vietnamese refugees. They're now people my age, you know, older. I'd love to see them playing more of a role of helping communities of unaccompanied minors, people who need help today. But I will tell you, I don't know, it doesn't mean it don't exist. I don't know of many great plans because people tend to move inward, but I would love to see a program that would bridge that gap because I think it could be very important.
Yeah, as you're talking, I'm thinking about the increase in unaccompanied minors, especially from Central America, who've come in probably illegally. So they're already suffering so much. They've left their family, maybe their family is deceased, who knows, right? So some kind of family, community connection, right? With probably, I'm just going to guess, maybe people more like them. So people from their community, I wonder if there's, just thinking out loud, more of an affinity towards somebody who would be like my mom or my dad or my relatives?
In general, we see that. So I used to work in a community, some of you may know it for the wine, but north of San Francisco, Napa. Napa, the underbelly of Napa, which I did a lot of work with, is a huge Hispanic community, mostly people from Mexico, but also people from the Northern Triangle. We worked to help resettle a woman and a child, long story, from El Salvador there. It worked well because, again, she speaks Spanish, obviously coming from El Salvador. She was able to culturally work in. Now I'm working with people who want to resettle 2 refugee families from Afghanistan there. I hope it will work, but the path is much harder because culturally it's totally different. Right. And there again, I'm glad it's 2 families because people need each other. People need to find people that are like them. We all want that. We all want to find people that we share something with, that you can connect with, that you can speak Arabic if that's your home language. You can, if you're Muslim, that you can find other Muslims in the community. If you're Catholic and you're from El Salvador, you can find a church that you go to. We need it, but I believe, Beth, in all of our work, for it to really work, we're going to have to go beyond that. Because, and that's why I emphasize in my question at the beginning is, have we not all experienced loss? Have we not all experienced all these things? What is it we want to find that goes beyond race or religion or nationality or language? And that's where I hold the space of treating people with dignity, the role of kindness, often overused in today's world, of simple kindness. I'm told so many stories of people who've gone, and there's a lot of bureaucracy and paperwork, but the difference that one human being who took an extra minute to really listen to someone's story and treat them with a little kindness, that made a lasting impact. And I think in all of our work, we have to hold a lot at one time. We have to hold maybe, and again, Beth, when you were looking at the bio and you said, we certainly need that kind of civil discourse, we need to find a space. We're dealing with America, and if you reduce it to major narratives, how are we going to find a space where we can meet? There's got to be a space where most of us can find a common ground. And I believe between perpetrator and victim, and again, someone else that I really believe has to be at the table, are the bystanders. What does it mean to be a bystander? Who are they? That's all subject for longer conversations.
So we only have a minute or 2 left. We're not going to be able to get to the other questions, but I just want to give you the opportunity. What is it you want to say in closing? What message do you want us to all take away from this very fascinating talk this past hour? Just one more minute.
First, I want to thank you, Beth, for making this possible and for inviting me in Columbia and the great work you're doing in the NECR program. I want to thank all of you for being part of it. I'm sorry I can't see you. I'm sorry I can't hear your stories. I'm sorry I can't learn more about you and what brought you here today. I want to leave you with just a couple points. I do this work because I think it makes a difference. I do this work because I think in all of us is a vulnerability, is a sense of being dispossessed, a sense of being powerless, especially in these times. Your work is critical. Whatever you do in the realm of conflict resolution or negotiation or peace building or all the other words I might describe it with, I ask you to hold in it this phenomena of the refugee experience, because I think it is quintessentially the human experience. As I grow older, you can see this nice gray hair out here in California. Life is about loss. Life is about how one grapples with loss, honors it, and goes on. And 2 final things. This phenomenon is only growing, sadly. There's more and more people on the move in this world for all kinds of reasons. We're going to see it in this country. We've seen it out here in California of the fires and towns wiped out. Where did those people go? What happened to them? Where are they living? And finally, to hold a truth that I hope you all know, whatever your role is in this field, in this world, your interest, you're doing something sacred. And this time on earth, what we can do is to try to make life a little bit better for other people, to try and give other people some sense of hope. As a dear friend of mine from Eritrea, Marin Semadar, said in a graduation speech at University of San Francisco, he said, hope is the oxygen of my life. Let's try not to let the world tear us apart. Let's try to stand together and let hope be the oxygen. So thank you all for being part of this. I wish you a meaningful Martin Luther King Day. And if you haven't read Letter from the Birmingham Jail, I implore you to read it.
Thank you so much, Lee, for all your thoughts and for all of you participating today. And for those of you who'll be viewing this webinar video afterwards, if you still have a question that has not been answered, please feel free to contact the NECR program and we'll be happy to respond ourselves or forward your question to Lee. Thank you all once again. Bye now.